Thank you, everyone. Please be seated. Good evening and welcome to this ordinary meeting of the Durham Union Society. We now proceed to the main item of business this evening and debate the motion before the House. The motion is, this House believes Islam is compatible with human rights. I first look to Professor Niaz Shah to open the case for the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to introduce the opposition, Joseph Robertson, Consultant and Director of the Orthodox Conservatives; Shiva Mahbobi, Spokesperson of the Campaign to Free Political Prisoners in Iran; and Maryam Namazie, Founder of the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain. These are your speakers, Mr. President, and they are most welcome. And I am speaking for the proposition. My name is Niaz Shah. I'm a professor in the law school at the University of Hull. I'm also a practicing barrister, practicing law from Nexus Chamber in London. As a researcher, I look at the relationship of Islamic law and human rights law, particularly in countries such as Pakistan and Afghanistan. In my view, Islamic law is compatible with human rights law. You would have noticed in the proposition it's the word Islam. I replaced it with Islamic law. And there is another phrase, human rights, I replaced it with human rights law. And that choice of replacement is deliberate, and I do this for two reasons. The first reason is that we want to give some focus and specificity to our discussion. Otherwise, we will be talking about topics they are not defined, and we will end up discussing endlessly without reaching any meaningful conclusion, in my view, on the compatibility, whether it is something is compatible with something else. And that's why I say the word law. And for example, when we talk about human rights, it begs the question, whose human rights? African version, Asian version, Muslim version, secular, religious, atheist, which version? And when we talk about Islam in general, it also begs the question, whose Islam? Is it Sunni Islam? Is it Shia Islam? Or which school within the Sunni tradition? So that's why I think it will assist everyone if we can have set broadly agreed upon standards on both sides, Islamic law and human rights law. And the second reason I would chose law is related to the touchstone. What is the touchstone? Compatibility. Compatibility of what with what? So we need to have a touchstone. And I face this in my research everywhere I go. Today's topic, the proposition is, this House believes that Islam is compatible with human rights. If I were in Pakistan, it will be written the other way around. Human rights. This House believes human rights are compatible with Islam because their people think Islam is their standards and everything else need to be compatible with that. So that's why in this country we have specific law called the Human Rights Act 1998. At the European level, we have a generally agreed upon set of human rights standards in the form of the European Convention on Human Rights. And here, in this country, this 1998 Act, Human Rights Act, Section 4, would empower senior courts to issue incompatibility declaration with human rights provisions. Which provision? The convention. So the touchstone is the convention. At international level, we got UN human rights treaties. There are about 9 core human rights treaties, and those are the content. I mean, those treaties are the result of compromises. They allow reservations, but most countries all over the world, the UN membership currently is 193. There's a broad agreement, and those who don't agree with certain provision, they enter reservations. So for me, for my discussion, my standard, the broadly agreed upon the UN human rights standard, rather than talking in vacuum or comparing Islam with the view of a particular individual. So those are the standards. Now, looking at the foundation of human rights law, the UN human rights law, they're based on human dignity, equality, and individual autonomy. And I want to, in the remaining time, I want to illustrate the compatibility of Islamic law or the concept of Islam human rights with those foundations of the UN human rights. Now, I say that Islam believes on human dignity. Look at the number of verses of the Quran, starting from the creation of men. There are other theories, Darwinian. We're talking about Islam. Now, looking at this, they say we have honored the sons of Adam. Remember, not Muslims. Everyone, they were created in good shape. God blew their spirit into them. God gave them knowledge and freedom, an exalted place in the God scheme of universe. Everything was created in the universe for the benefit of mankind. And when we say mankind, that includes everyone, men, women, atheists, theists, everyone. Now, individual autonomy is the part of, an aspect of human dignity. So, what is that human autonomy, individual autonomy? To choose, to pursue a set of values they want to believe in. And Islam exactly believes in that. The Quran says there is no compulsion in religion. Like any other Abrahamic religion, it believes on its propagation, but the propagation should be done in the most the best and the most gracious way, and then it's left to the believers. And those who need verses of the Quran, I have all here, and further I can get something out of the back, the actual copy of the Quran. Now, all these things leads to one thing, and I'm aware that in some countries there, so people can come, enter the fold of Islam. Once they enter, then they choose to abide by that code of life, and this is what they do. If they want to leave Islam, they can, under the principle of there is no compulsion of Islam. And I'm aware there are some penalties in some Muslim states for leaving Islam, what they call apostasy, but those are challenged by Muslim scholars, including myself, that there is no penalty for leaving Islam. That's my view. There could be different views as well. Now, coming to human equality and non-discrimination. That's the third foundation, equality, human equality in Islam. Human beings are born free, and you can go to the origin. That's according to the Islamic concept, the Quran, that all human beings were created from a single pair. They were divided into nations and tribes, only to know each other, not to despise each other. And there are several examples from the other primary sources of Islamic law. The last pilgrimage, for example, is very often the cited source, where the Prophet Muhammad said clearly that there is no preference of Arab or non-Arab, or white and black, etc. So when you look at all these three main foundations of human rights law, I'm talking about the UN treaties. For instance, human dignity is mentioned about 5 times only in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. When you look at all these, the human dignity, the foundations of Islamic law and human rights law are compatible. What is compatibility? Compatibility is the existence of two things together harmoniously. Existing of two things together. And Muslim states, they were part of the formation of the human rights treaties. Now they are members of the human rights treaties. And here and there they have inter-reservations, which is allowed. But the core, the foundation, there is compatibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I now look to Maryam Namazie to open the case for the opposition.
Speaking for the proposition are Professor Niaz Shah, Barrister and Professor of Law at the University of Hull, Dr. Mahshid Turner, Muslim chaplain for Durham University, and Abdullah Al-Andalusi, co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative. They are your speakers, Mr. President, and they are welcome. Most welcome. Can I start? Thank you. Thank you. Whether Islam is compatible with human rights is, of course, a key question, especially given the massive human rights violations that we see in many countries today, from Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. This is not a hypothetical debate. In practice, every hour of every day, we can see Islam is not compatible. We can see that Islam is antithetical to human rights. We can see that Islam is, in fact, a threat to human rights, particularly if it's Islam, and not just Islam, any religion, in power, in the state, in the law, in the educational system, in public policy. That is the end of human rights, LGBT rights, women's rights, free thought expression, and democratic politics. US suffragette Elizabeth Stanton said, "The Bible and the church are the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation." And I could say the same, that the Quran, Islam, Islamism, fundamentalism, all fundamentalisms are the greatest stumbling blocks and threats, not just to women's emancipation, but human emancipation. This is firstly because Islamic rights are based in texts and sunnah from 1400 years ago. It's not relevant to 21st century humanity. It is full of misogyny. For example, one hadith of Muhammad, the sayings and actions of Islam's prophet, he says, "I have left behind no fitna more harmful to men than women." That's from Al-Bukhari. And you see this also in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There's a Jewish prayer recited by men, of course, that says, "Thank you, Lord, who has not created me a woman." The problem, in my opinion, starts at the source, in the scripture, in the text. I want to quote Stanton again. "Every form of religion which has breathed upon this earth has degraded women, not just Islam. Look at the Hindu rite in Modi's India, the Jewish rite in the Palestinian territories, the Buddhist rite in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, and of course the Christian rite that we see on the rise in Europe, North America, and other places." I know there are Islamic feminists like Amina Wadud who say that the problem isn't Islam, but it's the patriarchal interpretations. However, in my opinion, you can't make an ideology that is fundamentally misogynist, pro-women's rights. An example is Surah 4, verse 34, which says men are the rulers of women. Amina Wadud, an Islamic feminist, will say it doesn't really mean that men are rulers. It means that they're there to guide women, that they're there to protect women. And we do hear arguments that say that it's not discrimination based on sex, but it's because of economics. Because men, for example, are the breadwinners. Or in the verse that says women can be beaten as a last resort if they're disobedient, it says, well, they can be beaten in a way that doesn't leave any marks on the body. And of course, these discussions are considered to be nuanced. And to say that this just isn't good enough is to be simplistic. But frankly, I think these arguments are more a defense of Islam than they are of women's rights or human rights. When it comes to interpretation, let's not forget that the Islamic feminist interpretation, which is lacking, is only one of many. And you cannot leave rights to the mercy of, let's face it, religious men who want to maintain their privilege. Islamic feminists say what they want. They can say whatever they want, but it is those in power that decide the authentic interpretation. And that's Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic regime of Iran, ISIS, Saudi Arabian regime. Secondly, Islamic human rights is based on serving God. Allah is at its center, which is why it fails so abysmally, based on a cruel, misogynist, merciless God with fragile sensibilities that demands submission and tolerates no dissent. Whereas universal human rights, it's the human being who's at the center. Thirdly, you cannot criticize Islam. You cannot change its fundamentals. You cannot reform it because it is seen to be divine, perfect, timeless. Take the hudud laws, stoning for sex outside of marriage, execution for apostasy, amputations for theft. These are fixed, mandated punishments. Of course, I know there are Islamic reformers like Abdullah and Naim. But if they live in Islamic states, they are either dead or in prison. On the other hand, human rights law can be changed, it can be developed, it can be reformed, it can be improved. It's not perfect, of course. But that is its strength, not its weakness. It is made by human beings for human beings. Another point is that in Islam, rights are based on your status, not on your person. Take personal status law, for example. Child custody goes to the father in a divorce at a preset age, even if the father is an abuser. It is about religious law being paramount and not child welfare. And there are many such examples. Sorry, can I have a glass of water, please? Human rights norms. Rights are for the individual, whatever their status. Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks. Also, if you look at Islamic human rights, it's conferred on the collective, in group, and only for those who behave, who submit. This is ignorant of the diversity that belongs to that so-called group, which is why it quickly becomes coercive and totalitarian, absolutist. There's a stark difference with this from human rights. Look, if you don't like abortions, if you don't like apostasy, if you don't like gay marriage, if you don't like blasphemy, don't do it. But recognize the right of other individuals to do so. You cannot use cultural particularism to deny other people's rights. The right to own sex slaves, the right to impose the burqa, which is a mobile body bag on women, the right to legally kill apostates in an ideal Islamic state. These are not rights. They are the denial and suppression of rights. It needs to be said, if your culture violates rights, it must be changed, it must be condemned, it must be abolished. You cannot legitimize violence and rights violations by saying it's your culture. And it's certainly not everyone's culture who is Muslim or presumed Muslim. This disregards the empirical evidence of diversity. Culture is not homogeneous. It is not static. It is not singular. There is dissent. There is contestation. There is resistance. For example, the veil is something that the Islamic regime of Iran has often said is women's culture in Iran. If it was the case, then it would not need to have such a widespread and vast machinery of suppression to arrest, to fine, to beat, to threaten women who are unveiled. And as you all know, Mahsa Jina Amini was killed in September last year for so-called improper veiling, and it was the start of the woman life freedom revolution in Iran. The Syrian Marxist Sadiq al-Az says, Western Orientalism is mirrored by this Orientalism in reverse of the fundamentalists, which manifests itself in the construction of Islamic human rights like we see in Iran and Saudi Arabia. It makes it no less reactionary, ahistorical, and anti-human. Finally, I do need to make this point as it often comes up. For sure, Western governments use human rights language to violate rights, just as the Islamists do. Many Western governments also violate human rights. Two examples will suffice. There are rights of civilians in war. The US is the only country that has used nuclear bombs, and the right to refugees and asylum seekers. That is a basic human right enshrined in international human rights law. And yet we see So many countless people dying on our shores, and it's still not enough for the Tories who want to send them back to Rwanda. Human rights has never been granted by governments. They have been fought for. People have died for them. They have been killed for them. Human rights has been secured by vast class, social, political, civil rights movements that has organized primarily against states, but also organized religion. It has never been granted by any state or by any god. Universal human rights represents the best of humanity's struggle for tolerance, for the respect of human beings, and for their rights and freedoms. Islam and religion represent some of the worst. Thank you.
Thank you, Maryam. I'd like to remind you all that you can, if you'd like to, get involved in the discussion at any time when the speakers are making their main arguments. You can stand up, put your hand up, go point of information. If you'd like to contest something that the speakers say, it's entirely up to them to decide whether or not to accept that point, but the option still remains. I now look to Dr. Mahshid Turner to continue the case for the proposition.
I think it's really, really important that we make a distinction between Islam and the perception of Islam. So what we heard now was the perception of Islam. So I'm going to talk a little about Islam. It'll be a reduction because you need years to really understand true Islam. But it's really important to say whether, is Islam compatible with human rights? What do we mean by Islam? So Islam, according to the Quran, means submission to God. In the Quran, it is stated, and to Allah prostrate all that is in the heavens and all that is in the earth. The word ma is used. Whatever is in the heavens and whatever is in the earth submits to the creator of the universe. Now, whether we like it or not, this is the case. This is how creation is. And to Allah prostrates whoever is within the heavens and the earth. So whoever now, man. So all people as well. So you can deny that status, but that's how we have been created. So Islam is the affirmation of that state, one of submission to the creator of the universe. So humans have been given the ability to uncover this truth themselves by reading the book of creation through the instruction of the revealed book, the Quran. When the first verse in the Quran was revealed to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he was told to read, Iqra. Since he is said to be an unlettered man, he asked, how should I read? And he was instructed to read in the name of his Lord. In other words, every one of us is actually able to make sense of the verses in the Quran and the signs in the creation. Signs, or ayat in Arabic, are means by which we can potentially find answers to existential questions. Who am I? Why am I here? And what is my final destiny? The ability to read the signs in creation is inbuilt in all human beings. The Quran, the book of instruction on how to read the signs in creation in order to find answers to our existential questions, addresses everyone. It does not make a distinction between men and women in that sense. Both men and women are encouraged to use their powers of reasoning and contemplation in order to look for meaning. The opportunity to be part of the harmony of the universe and feel connected is open to everyone, irrespective of race, sex, culture, class, and nationality. This is a truly human approach in which all individuals can occupy a central stage. However, the only way to see a true picture of reality not boxed-in perceptions. One must leave one's biases, assumptions, and prejudices behind. Reading the book of creation vis-à-vis the book of instruction, the Quran, can only be done accurately if we take off our spectacles, which are tarnished with our own assumptions, prejudices, and ulterior motives. Therefore, we cannot take isolated verses from the Quran and make judgments to look at incidents in creation partially or purely from a materialistic and utilitarian perspective. This view is biased and subjective and goes against human rights. For its aim is to force people to examine life within a limited framework. Islam is the opposite. It opens up that framework to a spiritual dimension, one of meaning making. Let me give you a simple example what a limited framework may look like. We may, for example, see a parent hitting their child on the back and jump to all sorts of conclusions before we see the whole picture. But if we had not gone past quickly, we would not have had a partial vision, but would see that the child had something stuck in her throat and the parent was trying to help the child to cough it up. This is what people who have their own agendas do. They present a partial picture of the verses of the Quran and examine those verses within their own terms in order to support their own argument, rather than looking at those verses in a holistic way. There is also the problem, and we're hearing all the time, of conflating Islam with Muslims. What happens in certain countries, Iran or whatever it might be, has nothing to do with Islam. It's like blaming Hiroshima on science. It is the misuse of science or knowledge that is the problem, not science itself. The same goes for Islam. True literacy is when we read in the correct way, that is, without bias, assumptions, and ulterior motives. Any discussion of rights to be truly meaningful can take only place with such caveats.
Thank you, Dr. Mahshid. I now look to Joseph Robertson to continue the case for the opposition.
Well, when I was asked to take part in this debate, the first question I had to define in my mind was nothing to do initially with Islam. It was the question of what human rights really are. And in reality, without the impact of religion, I don't think there could be such rights. Perhaps slightly sensitive remarks from my colleagues, which I'll expand on. But suffice to say, this reality makes the question posed no more or less difficult. Because what does exist are human duties. None of us are owed anything, but we are, if you believe in a God, part of an existential struggle to achieve an eternal reward. And we are, if you believe in the humanist religion, nothing more than sensitive animals with structures in place to best befit our evolution. Either way, we are owed nothing. But we do owe each other something, and fundamentally there are laws written into our nature that must be followed for the good of all. What then can we define as human rights? The right to life, or rather the duty not to kill? But why? Surely killing some people benefits the progress of society as a whole. Why is that a duty? Let's push it up a notch. The rights of women to be treated equally under the law. Well, if we're just animals, that's hardly a right. Men are the more dominant of the sexes, they take more risks, they're physically stronger, they're capable of keeping women under their control. Just as in other species of animals, we see the female dominating the male, or even eating it in some cases. I don't see an obvious right for women in that sense if we're only animals. Women have the power of reproduction, but that's a necessity for biological and human reproduction, for evolution. It must be used or we go extinct. It's not a right, it's a necessity. Likewise, let us think about the so-called rights of children and the elderly, the most vulnerable in society. The more compassionate amongst you might need to turn away, but the elderly are useless. In the wild, they'll be left to die. Children are the same. Without nurture, they'll be left to die. You begin to get the picture. On the animal level, we have no rights, just the fight for survival, nasty, brutish and short, to quote Hobbes. What gave us in the West the concept that men are more than animals, that we should be sensitive in all cases towards the condition of children, women, the elderly, all human beings, even when it does not profit us in the short term? How do we arrive at that conclusion? Not through the Enlightenment, since that was merely a reaction building a humanist framework to what had come before. Not the Protestant Reformation, since that divided legislation and fractured, in many cases, the rights enjoyed by the marginalised in society, particularly in this country, in the name of puritanical thinking. The uncomfortable truth for many is that in the modern West, the first transcultural institution to hegemonically codify the rights of women, the right of children to life and the elderly, the right to ownership of property, and in more recent centuries, the abolition of slavery, is the Catholic Church. When we talk about sexual equality between man and woman, we're citing old canon law. When we discuss why it is that the physically disabled should not be left to die, we're speaking in the West, regardless of our personal belief as Christians. When we raise eyebrows at polygamy or infidelity, we're subconsciously citing the words of Christ, "What God has joined, let no man put asunder." The entire moral framework of the West was built by this institution of the Catholic Church, and the so-called human rights we now benefit from derive from the teachings of that institution, and thus we must rephrase the question, is Islam compatible with Christian morality? To answer this question, we must remember two fundamental precepts of Islam. One, Muhammad is an excellent example for all men to follow, and two, the Quran is an eternal message for all times and all places. When confronted with these two facts, the idea that concepts in the Islamic faith which affront our sensibilities in the West can be done away with by modern Islamic interpretation is nonsensical. Either the Quran is eternally truthful and divinely inspired, or you can no longer be a Muslim. There are no ifs or buts about it. So again, with these two principles in mind, let us see some of what Islam really teaches. I will refer once again to the treatment of women, often called into question within the Quran. Certain passages stand out as unexplainable in a satisfactory way. If, as a Muslim, one believes the Quran is unblemished and without error, these passages must be taken to stand as the norm throughout history and must stand up to questioning in the present day. Men are a degree above them. Quran 2:228. 4:11, speaking on inheritance, for the male what is equal to the share of two females. In terms of sexual rights, conduct and the ownership of women, female sex slaves, Quran 2:223, we see, your wives are as a tilth or owned land unto you, so approach your tilth when or how ye will. Wife to husband ratio, marry those that please of you, other women 2 or 3 or 4, 4:3. Whoever you cannot find the means to marry free, believing women, then he may marry from among those whom your right hand possesses of believing slave girls, 4:25. In 23:5-6, 70:29-30 of the Quran, we see permission for men to have sexual access to what their right hand possesses, meaning female captives or slaves. For the Prophet himself, coincidentally an example to all men, but equally capable of doing things that other men were not permitted to do. We read in Quran 33:50, O Prophet, indeed we have made lawful to you your wives, to whom you have given their due compensation, and those your right hand possesses from what Allah has returned to you of captive slave girls, a long list of family dispensations only applicable to Muhammad, a believing woman who gives herself to the Prophet, if the Prophet wishes to marry her. This is only for you and not for other believers, not other Muslims. We certainly know what we've made obligatory upon them, meaning other Muslims, concerning their wives and those their right hand possesses. But this is for you, O Muhammad, in order that there will be upon you no discomfort, and ever Allah is forgiving and merciful. That's great for Muhammad. Polygamy and the ownership of women is therefore codified. It is always the will of men that must be followed, or in particular the will of the Prophet of Islam, whom Allah considers first among men. Again, we read in Quran 33:50, you, O Muhammad, have been put aside all of whom you will, or take to yourself whom you will, and any that you desire of those wives from whom you had temporarily separated, there is no blame upon you in returning her. We get the picture. Muhammad is allowed to break laws that no other Muslim is allowed to break. These passages not only allow the Prophet far greater ease of access to whatever woman he so desires than the average believing Muslim, but the average believing Muslim can, of course, still use his wife or wives however he chooses, but also display a discriminatory idea to the Western mind of sexual or moral ethics, or rather lack thereof. In Christianity, therefore in Western culture, and ultimately in the basis of the human rights we're here to debate, monogamous marriage, but particularly the equal partnership of the sexes, is sacred, as in Jesus' words from the Gospel of Matthew. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians 5:21, focuses on married couples being subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. The Quran reveals, in contrast, as we've heard in Surah 4:34, men are the managers of women. When women are disobedient, they may beat them, they may put them apart in other beds and deny them sexual intercourse. A little shocking, I think, to the Western mind. But all this pales perhaps in comparison to the treatment of young girls, embedded once again into the basis of belief.
Point of information.
Rejected. The iddah, or waiting period before remarriage for women who were to be divorced, was set originally by Muhammad at 3 menstrual cycles to avoid confusion over post-divorce pregnancies. However, Muhammad's followers started to question him regarding those of their wives who had not attained or could not attain menstrual cycles. And that, according to all relevant sources, is when the following verse came about in Quran 65:4. As for your women past the age of menstruation, in case you do not know, their waiting period is 3 months. And for those who have not menstruated, i.e. prepubescent, the same as well. As for those who are pregnant, their waiting period ends with delivery. Thus we see that marriage and consummation is permitted in Islam in the foundational text in the Quran with girls who have not yet reached the age of puberty. Taken into context with earlier verses on ownership and beating of disobedient wives, the ramifications of this need no further elaboration. Child brides are all too common in many Muslim societies, and the scary thing is that this practice isn't just cultural, it's entirely justified in the foundational scripture of Islamic belief. I'm sure many good Muslims would themselves be repulsed by this idea. So we have to ask ourselves, is that what we want for the West? Now we turn to violence, compulsion, and ultimately jurisdiction, which I don't want to spend as long on because I'm sure it'll be touched on by others. But I do have to retort to a point on compulsion in religion that was mentioned earlier, which I thought would probably come up. So this is verse 256 of the Quran. There is no compulsion in religion. The problem is that surahs 9 and 5 are the last major chapters of the Quran that Muhammad recited. So this makes some of what before lose its weight in weight of meaning when we take those verses separately. Fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of the truth, even if they are the people of the book, i.e. Christians and Jews, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Well, that sounds a little bit like compulsion to me. Once again, we have the Quran sanctioning violence at least as a means of coercing religion. And the Muslim apologist might say to me now, no, that was only for a time period in Arabia, back in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, at the very initiation of Islam. No, either the Quran is true for all eternity or it's not. You have to pick one. We continue into Quran 9:11, but if they repent and establish worship and pay the poor due, then they are your brethren in religion. Taken side by side with the preceding passage, this confirms that the Quran is indeed speaking of conversion to Islam. Quran 2:193, and fight them until the fitna is no more, and religion be only for Allah. But if they desist, let there be no hostility except against the wrongdoers. The key phrase here is to fight until religion be only for Allah. When will that be?
Point of information.
Rejected. Now finally we see in Quran 3:83, are they seeking a religion other than Allah's when every soul in the heavens and the earth is submitted to Him willingly or by compulsion? Which means that religion is allowed to be enforced by compulsion. The earlier verse 2:256 states that there is no compulsion in religion. So here we see another contradiction which is said to be resolved by abrogation. However, in abrogation, the later verse resolve supersedes the earlier one. I could go on for far longer through the canon of Islamic texts, for longer than my 10 minutes would allow, and have not yet ventured into the hadiths, blasphemy laws, or spoken regarding the punishment of apostasy from Islam being death, or considered the formality of jihad, or spoken on modern-day cultural practices outside the West. I've chosen to dwell predominantly only on aspects of the Quran, since the Quran is the one source which no Muslim apologist may dispute. There are many good men and women in Islam, there are many good things in the Quran, derived from elements of Christianity and Judaism. Yet I put it to those who follow Islam and claim to be advocates of human rights. Do you remain advocates of those rights because you follow the Quran, or in fact because you do not condone all that the Quran permits? I would put it to my audience that in no way considered as a whole can we subsequently maintain that Islam is compatible with Christian morality and by extension is diametrically opposed to the foundation of those very human rights.
Joseph. I now look to Abdullah al-Andalusi to close the case for the proposition.
Dear, oh dear, what a marathon of misconceptions. There's so little time. So, where to begin? Firstly, Islam obviously has multiple schools of thought, but the interesting discussion today, and today's debate, is not about whether you agree with Islam. If you did, you'd be Muslim, and we kind of may be having a moot discussion. But if any of you do want to join, you can pick up a membership card outside, and you get 20% off your next kebab at the local place. However, we need to look at what we mean by human rights, because no one can agree on what human rights means, and we need to discuss it. Do we rely on some old guys from the 17th century who disagree with each other about what human rights is? Do we rely on the UN, European Union, or Boris Johnson? God forbid.
He just designed him.
Yeah. So what we have to look at is human rights must mean something. So let's come to at least a basic understanding just for us to debate this for the point of today. Human rights, if it means anything, is rights or laws which are established, which give a universal set of laws which are inviolable by society or arbitrary rule. I.e., you live in a state where the leader can't do whatever he wants to you, and society can't do whatever they want to you because you have these inviolable laws. Does Islam provide that? That's simply the question. If it does, then it provides human rights. But if you're trying to say, oh, but I have a particular understanding of human rights, I may be a liberal, or I may be a Marxist, or a conservative, or which have you, or an anarchist, or a libertarian, well, you guys all can't agree, right? So we need to have at least debate on something that we all can agree on. And I think the first premise is that human rights are universal and give you freedom from arbitrary rule. John Locke himself argued this. John Locke was argued, what is freedom? Is it just you can do whatever you want? He says, no. Freedom is that people live under known laws and that you can do whatever you want within the law, such that if you annoy the leader, they can't just kill you or take your property away from you. As long as you keep within the law, you have freedom inside it, right? That is the definition of freedom, the only definition of freedom that John Locke offered. And there is no other definition of freedom, because if you say freedom from restrictions, well, that might be an anarchist. And even then, in anarchy, there's a state of nature, state of war with other human beings, as Hobbes would argue. Now, if you talk about, well, isn't it pretty straightforward? Freedom of speech, it just means, freedom to say whatever you want. Really? Because there's some people will say they want to say racial slurs. And others will say, no, you don't have freedom of speech to say racial slurs. But there are some in America who will say, no, we should have the right. And they'll say, if you deny us that right, then you're denying my human rights to be racist or to say racist arguments. And you might say, no, but that's not part of freedom of speech. Or someone might say, I have a right to be referred to by the personal pronouns that I choose. So today, everyone refer to me as je and je and whatever the hell that is. You can refer to me as that if you like. But to say that it is mandatory now because I have a human right to be referred to that, well then, some might say, but you're compelling my speech then, So these are the issues. Personal freedom. Some might say, well, as long as you have a relationship that is consensual, all is okay. Oh, except if it's polygamy. Even if there's a polygamous relationship where everyone consents, oh, no, not that, because that goes against the biblical Christian values that Joseph was talking about, even though in the Bible, it never really prohibits polygamy anywhere. Interesting. The Jews practiced it, Jesus knew of it, but no prohibition. And of course, Christians in West Africa still practice it today. Of course, some of my opponents here might argue against freedoms that you might believe in. You might believe that a woman should have a right to wear what she wants in public, except of course being completely nude, which obviously in many Western states is prohibited, of course. But Maryam Namazie will go a step further. She'll say, no. I believe that women do not have the right to cover their face in public, even if they choose to do so, even if they are comfortable doing so. She said in public that she wants to ban the niqab and deprive women of that right. And yet she's arguing on the side of human rights today, quote unquote. What about freedom of ownership? Well, I guess we all believe in freedom of ownership, of course. Except, again, Maryam Namazie, who's a Marxist. And of course, a Marxist would say that private property is theft and is denying people's rights to own that property that you own. So she would disagree of that. And Marx would disagree of that. But you might say, but I think we should have ownership. Again, people can't agree. What about equality? Well, we all believe that all humans are born equal and have should have equal consideration, but even in the UK law, there is different treatment to different people based on your circumstances. For example, there's the law of equality in England and Wales allows people, tell people you must treat people the same, but there are exceptions in sports, in the army, for example, or in certain employments that might require a male or female position, like in the gym or so on and so forth. And in positive action, of course, you're allowed to discriminate. So no one cares about gender segregation in sports, do they? But until it comes to dealing with Muslims, of course, in the mosque. Why do you gender segregate? Well, then why don't you allow men and women to participate together in sports then? Why you segregate? So you can make all these arguments about human rights. But the real argument is, does Islam give a universal set of values that is inviolable by anyone? Well, Islam gives the freedom of ownership. People, you can own everything that is permissible. You can't own drugs, of course, as a Muslim, but you're allowed to own things, and the state can't deprive you of that, even if the state wants to rob you of your resources. So Namazie would hate that about Islam. But what freedom of ownership? That's robbing the proletariat. Islam believes in equality of value. The Quran talks about men and women, that men and women, one of you is as the other. And there's many verses that talk about believing men and believing women who do righteous deeds, they will be rewarded in hereafter. They refer to equally. Men and women have equal value. But in Islam, we don't believe that equality equals identicality. I think everyone's misread Aristotle. He didn't say equal things should be treated equally. He said identical things should be treated identically. Misread the Greek there. Men and women aren't identical. So there must be some considerations here and there, which even the UK law allows. For example, in the UK, obviously, a woman can never be prosecuted for rape because she doesn't possess the biological tool for rape, but she can be only prosecuted for a sexual assault. Why that disparity? Oh, they'll say because it's a biological reality. Oh, okay, so you accept that as a principle. So why do you condemn others who merely point out that there are biological realities and considerations? Islam prohibits things like torture, which America doesn't necessarily prohibit in its dealings around the world. The Prophet Muhammad said that anyone who tortures people in this world will be tortured by God in the next. So things like this. Freedom of intellectual inquiry, debate and questioning. The Prophet Muhammad had the first debates with Christians, and the Christians denied he was a prophet to his face, kind of implying he's either a madman or a liar. And he fed them and he gave them hospitality, and they even, according to one narration, prayed in the Prophet's mosque before going, Christian prayers, the first mosque, before going back to their lands. So Islam encourages debates, encourages discussions. You'll find works written, the first refutations of Islam are written in the Middle East from the time of the Islamic times by St. John of Damascus, who's a Christian saint, who wrote the first attacks against Islam. He published that book in Islamic Syria. It's permitted. We welcome intellectual discussions and deliberations. But the issue is that rights don't exist. Rights are simply something which is instituted as obligations that humans have to each other. The question is, who has the authority to do so? We would argue only God has, of course, but to any other argument, you have to be about convenience. Oh, well, we believe that rights are convenient. Well, then what if they're no longer convenient? Then, as the CIA argued, they could possibly torture people because it will hopefully save people's lives. So they got rid of that right. And that's why I think that revelation guarantees people's rights better than materialistic-based ideologies, because in materialism, I suppose, it's about convenience. Your rights are only if they're convenient to the public. And the God of human convenience giveth, and the God of human convenience equally taketh away when it's no longer convenient. Now, as to this discussion, Islam there's many misrepresentations, and I wrote a whole page of them and I won't have much time. So I'm going to go through as many as I possibly can. And in the Q&A, please bring up any I missed, because I want to go through every single one if I can. So they argue, so one was argued that men are made rulers of women. No, the verse of the Quran, when it's used the word Qawam, it refers to like guardians of the household. A man is a guardian of his household, not that men rule over women generally. So the husband has responsibility for his wife. That's simple, to protect her and to give his life, if need be, to defend her. The argument is that, as they say, you can beat your wives. The Prophet Muhammad said in authentic narration, he said, do not beat the handmaidens of God, which is basically women, basically the handmaidens of God, nor insult them. Okay, so these are issues that I think are misrepresented in the Islamic, they've misrepresented on the side, and there's so much more to discuss, including, for example, how Islam gave tolerance to Christians and Jews and other faiths, even their own law systems. We didn't enforce our law on Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians and so on. They had their own law courts, their own practices. Right? In some cases, some practices incest, we didn't interfere, because Islam is not to be compelled. So please do forgive me for not being able to cover everything. They mentioned quite a lot. Please bring up in the Q&A. But if you see the opposition has failed to argue that Islam does not give at least some rights, you might not agree with it, but give rights which are inviolable. If you do not see the opposition has argued against that, then please vote for the proposition. Islam gives rights. You might not agree with it, but it does indeed give rights for humans. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah. I finally look to Shiva Mahbobi to close the case for the opposition.
Thank you. I believe Islam is not compatible with human rights. Not just that, but it actually violates the fundamental rights of human beings. And I lived under the Islamic regime from the age of 10 following the 1979 revolution until the age of 24, that I had to leave Iran because I was going to be arrested again. I spoke against Islamic law as an atheist, as a women's rights activist, and I was arrested twice at the age of 12, yes, 12, for a few days, and at the age of 16 for more than 3 years. So my argument is based on what has been happening in Iran in the last 44 years under an Islamic law, where the regulation, laws, and policies are based on Quran, and it's been implemented, and also based on my own experience as an atheist and women's rights activist. And of course, I refer to Quran because this is not my perception, and this is not just the Islamic regime in Iran, as some of my colleagues mentioned the verses. I only, because of the limitation in time, I only mentioned 3 aspects: women's rights, homosexuality, and also freedom of expression and belief. And there are many examples, obviously, in Saudi Arabia, in Afghanistan, but are only focusing on Iran. When it comes to women, I'm thinking about my own experience as a woman in Iran. Every aspect of my life was invaded and attacked by the Islamic law. So I did not have the same law as my brother, for example. According to the law, woman needs to have permission from men in the family. And actually, it's legalized, obviously. The Article 1105 of the regime saying that in relationship between husband and wife, the position of the head of the family is exclusive to the husband. Women do not have the right to have permission to travel without the permission of husband. The inheritance, meaning then my right is less than my brother because I'm a woman. And all this discrimination
Enough information.
I rejected. All this basically because of my gender. And as well as when you think after the revolution, when Khomeini ordered the hijab law, they attacked women, tortured and killed women, and if they disobeyed the Islamic law. And when you look at it, there are so many laws that created for us women. When in the Article 102 of the regime talks about women who appears on the street without hijab, they are condemned to 74 lashes. And a very recent example, my colleague mentioned Mahsa Amini, who was, because of not having hijab, I rejected. And it's not just him, millions of women basically been victims of the Islamic law that had been purposed on them, basically imposed on them. You might say this is just the basically Islamic regime. It's not Quran, but I will refer to Quran, how this is implemented basically and originated from Quran. And it goes on. If I mention again about sexual relationship, women's sexual relationship, in Iran, according to the law, talks about adultery and the punishment of stoning, which is exactly what it says in Quran. The punishment for adultery for women who have relationship outside of the marriage is, it says, confine them to in the house until they die. So in Iran, the Islamic law even give the power to men to punish women if they disobey them and even kill them, and which we know it as honor killing. And in Iran, many women were killed for disobeying their father, brother, husband, and the perpetrators were either being released or being given lenient sentences. There are many examples, including Mona Haydari, 17 years old, beheaded by the husband, and 14 years old Romina Ashrafi, who was killed by father because of having boyfriend. And again goes on in the penal code how it says the father and paternal grandfather are not to be retaliated against for killing their child. Okay, is this my perception, or is this just the Islamic regime in Iran? In Surah An-Nisa, talks about the men are the caretaker of the women, and talks about that women must be obedient to men. And as my colleague mentioned, that if you sense ill conduct from your women, advise them first. If they persist, don't share the bed. And if they persist, discipline them. This is not my perception. This is not just the Islamic regime in Iran. This is Quran that's saying that women are not equal. Again, in Surah An-Nisa, in verses, talks about how women should cover their body, hijab, and should not draw attention to their body. This is what the Islamic regime does. Morality police attacks us, kills us, and tortures us because they implement Quran. And then again, there are many others. In Surah An-Nisa, verses 15, talks about adultery. Those of your women who commit illegal intercourse, means adultery, confine the offender to their homes until they die. This is not my perception, definitely. And homosexuality, second point. In Iran, under the Islamic regime, homosexuality is punished by death. They don't even acknowledge transgender because you have to be either men or women. They are forced to go under surgery to become either man or woman. That's how the human rights work in Islam. And the punishment for sodomy, which they describe as sexual intercourse with a male, that would be death. If men touch each other, kiss each other, 31 to 74 lashes. If they are lesbian, up to 100 lashes. And then when you think about it, when the third point goes to freedom of expression and belief. Again, in Iran, the charge called waging war against God, and you're going to be killed for that. And the punishment in the Islamic regime's penal code, hanging, crucifixion, amputation of right hands and left foot, or banishment. In Surah Al-Madiyah, it says, whoever who commit wage war against Allah, they should be punished by death, crucifixion, cutting off their hands and feet, and opposite side, or exile from the land. Is this my perception? Is this only the Islamic regime in Iran? No, this is Quran. And then again, Surah Fair, Surah Tawab, talks about disbeliever and blasphemy, and talks about them that they should be, it's interesting, one of the speakers talks about that God doesn't allow torture or something like that. It says that Allah should torment those who commit blasphemy with a painful punishment, whatever that punishment is. And if you again go back to, I'm just trying to compare the law in Iran and Quran. And in Iran, again, anyone who insults Islam or imams should be executed. Surah An-Nisa talks about disbelievers and says if they turn away, meaning they didn't repent, then seize them and kill them wherever you find them. It's interesting. It reminds me of Salman Rushdie. 34 years ago, Khomeini issued a fatwa to kill Salman Rushdie for writing satanic verses and told every Muslim around the world that it's their duty to kill them.
And after that, last year, Salman Rushdie was attacked and lost an eye, obviously. And you know, fatwa doesn't have expiry date. And then when you think about it, Charlie Hebdo, another example, just because they published a caricature of Muhammad, 12 people were murdered there. And this is, again, referencing to that. And when I was 18 years old, and I was taken to a mullah who called himself a judge and was told me, do you know your sentence is execution because you are an infidel? And again, these all coming from Quran and disbelievers. And again, in 1988, Khomeini ordered the execution of more than 5,000 political prisoners. The question they asked them, are you a Muslim or not? If they would say no, they would be sent for execution. There are many examples. So basically, for talking here, criticizing Islam, my punishment is death. According to Quran, according to basically Islamic regime. So at the end, I want to conclude my argument by saying that Islam is violating the basic rights of human beings in every sense possible. And in any country where they come under power, I'm not talking about here, we can sit here and talk about Islam for hours. When they come under power, they implement Islam, they implement Quran, and they violate the human rights of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiva. The debate is now open to speeches from the floor. If you wish to make a full speech, please make your way to either of the dispatch boxes in the front. And a reminder to please state your name and college for the purposes of the minutes. In the interest of time, please, Madam Assistant Secretary, could you please limit the speech to 2 minutes only. A reminder that we have a fantastic prize as well, courtesy of our sponsorship officer. So good luck to anyone who's making any full speeches. Do we have anyone who wants to make a full speech? You can come to the front and state your opinion on the motion to win this prize. No? Okay, going once. Going twice. We have one speech from the gentleman.
Yes.
Would you like to come to the front?
In proposition or opposition? Opposition. Is it allowed?
Just stand at the
any?
dispatch box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. My name is Saeed Kalamurad, and I was also born in Iran. But it's interesting that the proposition always referred to perception, interpretation. And they said, it doesn't prove that where interpretation comes from. They just say it's your interpretation, it's your perception. You're not actually reading the right Quran. You don't know what the Quran says. Quran says all the best thing for human rights. You would be having the best time of your life if you're Muslim. If you are obeying the Quran, you are the best person in the world. You go to heaven and you get so many benefits. And if you're opposition, you're perception. You're delusional. You're not actually knowing what are you talking about. So this is a repression. This is a suppression. Why? Because we can see it's not interpretation. You know what it is? Because it's not in power. Of course, when it's subdued to a mosque in a neighborhood, cannot implement any of the laws. But when it comes to power, when it has the power means to torture you, to confine you, to kill you, to force you to wear hijab, and if you don't wear it, to get 70 to 100 lashes, then it's a real Islam, it's a real verses in real Quran. It's not perception, it's not delusion, it's not in power. If Islam is in power, I will not be allowed to talk in here. Like my colleague Shiva Mahbobi said, I will be handcuffed, taken to prison, tortured, killed, and executed. That's the difference between perception. They say perception because they're not in power. Remember when Christianity was in power? But now Christianity cannot imply the law. Islam is the same thing. Perception, delusion, yes. If they come to power, they have to implement every single verses in Quran, and every single verses in Quran aggressively and violently violates human rights in every aspect. They're not in power. That's what they're saying, delusion or illusion or perception. When they're in power, it's violent. Every aspect of your life would be controlled, especially if you're a woman. You have absolutely no right as a woman. Yes, this is my perception, but also my reality, living in a country where the rule of law is done by Quran, when the Islam is ruling everyone's life.
Point of information.
Rejected. Can I reject?
Your 2 minutes are done.
Can I answer or I have to go and sit?
No.
Further speeches from the floor. We'll go to the gentleman over the back.
Mine's not really a speech, more of a question.
We'll do questions in a second. Thank you. Any further speeches from the floor? Go to the gentleman over here. You want me to keep it to 2 minutes, please, or less?
Ethan Stevenson, South College. I just want to pick up on something that I feel hasn't really been discussed regarding Islam, and that is Islam's view to images, especially those that depict the human figure. Islam strictly prohibits this, and so has actually created many beautiful pieces of artwork and architecture. However, what this has also led to are great tragedies and the loss of human heritage. And this has happened both in the past and much more recently. You need only look at the Buddhas of Bamyan in Afghanistan. You need only look at Palmyra a few years ago. History of 1,000 years, pinnacles of human civilization, human art, destroyed in seconds.
Point of information.
By fundamentalists, rejected.
You can't reject.
What I'm saying now is that anything logically that seeks to destroy the image of a human being will eventually destroy humans themselves. This is not only true of Islam. You have an example across from you in the cathedral. Smashed sculptures, heads chopped off statues, and at the same time, all across the country, more churches being smashed, heads rolling, people burning.
Yeah.
Whenever the image of mankind is destroyed, mankind himself will be burnt. Thank you.
Order over there. Thank you. Do we have any further speeches from the floor? We'll do one more speech before we end. One for the gentleman there. Oh, sorry, 1 second. So go over there.
Yeah. My name is Muhammad. I'm from Indonesia. I'm in business school at Durham University. First, I would like to say this moment has been very shocking for me because I'm living in Indonesia where people don't really have hostility really to the religion. Today, you really hurt me. I think it has violated my human rights of enjoying beauty of my religion. And maybe I will tell you and to include respect to my feeling as part as human right. If you guys agree Islam to be compatible with human rights, let's vote for human rights to respect people's feelings, not just people's rationality. Just now, I want to ask a question. You stop me. You say, hey, you cannot say no to transgender, but you cannot stop people from saying that. I just want to ask a question. Why stop me? You don't have right to stop me. If you say I don't have right to stop people complaining something, why do you even stop me? So yes, everything has rule. This chamber, this house has rule. People cannot live without rules. And if you really purely have respect to other, at least, at the very least, respect their feeling. I understand. Extremism is against human rights. And I understand what's happening in Iran is against human rights. Not because of the religion, but because of the people. Just now I want to raise my question. I want to clarify. When you mentioned just now, in this ayah, I want to know, have you read Tafsir Ibn Kathir? Have you read Tafsir Tabari? Have you read this? I want to ask you a question. When you mentioned just now about inheritance, have you read Karen Armstrong book? And if now, for example, here Karen Armstrong is here, and Karen Armstrong reading his page 16, saying that Islam has given inheritance and given the right for divorce centuries before Western civilization get it, how will you say that to Karen Armstrong, who has written so many books more than any one of us here? Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
For those who made speeches from the floor, we now proceed to questions from the floor. Do you have any questions for either side or either sides tonight of the House? We start with gentleman in the middle row there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We can ask him a question. It's asking the speakers.
Sorry? No, ask the speakers. For the speakers.
Oh, the
questions
speakers.
for the speakers.
Okay, I'll pass that. I just wanted to ask him.
Okay, no worries. We go to the back over there, please.
Right. So do I have to state my name?
And college, please, yeah.
My name is Hoshan. I'm from St. Chad's College. My question to the speakers on both sides is what their thoughts are. Like, what are your thoughts on the idea of moderate Islam? Is that a thing that exists? Is that possible? Because I think when we think about moderate Islam in the geopolitical context, states like Turkey, like Indonesia, like Malaysia get brought up. So is that possible, or is that some sort of unstable state?
We'll start with the proposition.
Well, Islam is Islam. So when we say moderate Islam, then we are talking about practice. And this is what I'm trying to say. All these talks are about regimes who do this, their actions. Okay, criticize them. I criticize them. But why do they suddenly jump to Islam? Islam is creation. Islam is what you see. Islam is the beauty, harmony. You look out there, that's Islam. But, when we interfere and mess up, and what do? They blame Islam. So there's no moderate Islam. Islam is reality. So it's when people interact with that and interpret in according to their egos or according to their, beliefs, then it becomes, they use it in an instrumental way, see the things in a materialistic way, then they becomes manipulated.
I think we get the opposition.
Is it one person can answer?
It's only one person.
Huh? One? Okay.
Opposition. Decide between yourselves.
Well, we all want to each one to speak. So
you just keep it to one person from either side answering questions.
You can do it.
Go ahead, man. Go ahead.
Well, I think, first of all, Muhammad, I'm sorry if you're hurt, my love. There's no intention to hurt anyone. But you have to understand, too, that the Quran and many of the tenets hurt me as well. When it says that apostates need to be killed, it hurts my feelings, too. But the reality is that we have to be able to speak about these things, respecting human beings, respecting each other's rights, but at the same time being able to speak about injustice, because that's the only way our world can move forward. On the issue of moderate Islam, I think that the reality is that Islam, and not just a matter of perception, but we're talking about the text, the verses in the Quran, the hadith, the saying and actions of Muhammad, Islam's prophet, Islamic jurisprudence, these make up Sharia. And if you look at the question of stoning, for example, that is part of the hadith. Muhammad himself permitted a woman to be stoned to death. Domestic violence comes from surahs in the Quran. And so what I want to say is that there is no moderation in the text, just as there isn't in the Bible, just as there isn't in the Torah. But I think there is moderation in the way many Muslims live their lives, in the sense that, or many Christians or many Jews, people don't live exactly by the book, because if they did, I think the world would be a much more horrible place. But I think Islam or any religion can only be moderate if it isn't in power. Then, like Christianity, it's no longer leading inquisitions and burning witches at the stake, but it's, you know, organizing soup kitchens and helping the homeless, as long as you agree to pray after they do it. So I think that's where moderation comes. It's when religion isn't in power. When it is in power, I think it's not a question of perception. Our lives, we are refugees from Iran because of the human rights violations, and not just because the Iranian government is special, the Saudi government. Indonesia, Aceh province has Sharia law. In Malaysia, there is Sharia law. Apostasy is punishable by death. What is the punishment for apostasy in Islam? What is the punishment for adultery? Death by stoning. Is that true or not? Is that true or not?
Can I respond?
That's
She's asked
a
a question to
question
us.
that needs to be asked when
How
we
many
speak about
apostates have been
moderation.
killed in the last 100 years by any regime?
Just two last.
Nope.
Two last week.
Bring me the source.
Two last week.
Bring me the source, mate.
In Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia. For apostasy, that's for adultery. Also confession.
Can we get some order in the House, please? We'll move on to the next question. Next question, please, to either of the sides.
If someone could ask us a question that we haven't dealt with, we can respond to it.
So to the opposition first, they've been mentioning statements of belief, misogynistic, homophobic from the Quran, but there's a big distinction between statements of belief and commandments. The Quran, strictly speaking, has very few commandments, like very few, only with inheritance, etc. So wouldn't you say, since the question is strictly speaking compatibility with human rights, that you can hold, you're entitled, you're entitled to hold as many absurd beliefs as you want, like people can hold absurd beliefs and still abide by human rights? And a very quick question to the proposition, wouldn't you say, since like morality is an evolutionary process, we're evolving morally over time, so sticking to a set of values that have on any period of time, whether now or historically, perhaps when you can see that we're against human rights, sticking to any values of human rights from one period restricts our progress in the future?
Thank you. Could you please make our answers very succinct and compact?
Sure. Well, I mean, there are tons of commandments in the Quran, and one example that I particularly gave was the menstrual cycle, the Iddah. Okay, so after a woman is divorced, she's given a waiting period of 3 menstrual cycles. This was an issue because there were prepubescent girls being married. And the response from Allah in the Quran was that it's the same waiting period of 3 months for prepubescent girls. That's a very deliberate and exercisable affront to what I would consider to be paedophilia.
All right, so, okay, finally, all right, so, okay, well, let's just explain. So I don't believe in reforming or changing or any kind of moderate Islam. I believe Islam is Islam. I believe that there are certain principles which are timeless. I mean, people are harking on about democracy. That's 1,000 years older than Islam. And that's yet modern, apparently, right? So, so people people read Plato and Aristotle like they're modern books. They say, oh, they speak to me today. They speak to us today. Now, when I talk about misrepresentation, that's not the opponents. It's not because I have this liberal interpretation of Islam. No, I have it. The interpretation as for Muslims, we take it from the practice of Prophet Muhammad based on narrations and applied historically by an Islamic caliphate system that was for about 1,300 years until colonialism destroyed it. And then after what came afterwards, or these post-colonial, mostly secular states that hijack Islam, hijack because they don't implement Islam. Very simply, the Quran says, Quran bans usury, interest, right? The Quran says, take notice of war from Allah and His Messenger to those who deal in usury, right? So God prohibits it very bigly. In Iran, interest banking is permissible. In Saudi Arabia, interest banking is permissible. Hanging in Iran, that's not an Islamic punishment. Where'd that come from? Oh yes, England, right? They thought that's a modern punishment. Let's use that. They borrowed it. right? They even borrowed their political system based on England, although Prince Charles doesn't give fatwas anymore. But still, the head of state, the same structure, everything. So the Muslim world, which we are currently is not implementing Islam and is hijacking Islam, because you compare it to classical understandings of Islam by classical political theorists in the medieval times. Let's say, just pick up any book by a classical Muslim theorist from 10th century, 12th century, 8th century, whatever, you'll see a marked difference. And that's what I'm trying to represent here today. So I don't think of any change, what have you, because you'd like to think that humans wouldn't evolve to say, well, let's no longer respect the right to life. We've evolved beyond that. Let's let the survival of the fittest. That's the best moral motto. You know, social Darwinism, right? Do you really want that as the new moral paradigm because it was meant to improve the gene pool of the people? No. And just to illustrate the misconception, what they said, for example, the gentleman there, Joseph, mentioned, it says in the Quran that you can free menstrual cycles once you divorce a prepubescent. It doesn't use the word prepubescent. Point out which verse says prepubescent, any Arabic word or even the English translation. It doesn't. Why? Because some people, if they have a wife who might be 18 years old, 19 years old, some women get delayed menses and they need to know what to do, right? But to say that that refers to prepubescence. See, this is the misrepresentation we're talking about, right? And please, in anyone who wants to ask a question, ask us a question by every single point they mentioned that we didn't bring up, because the more you ask, the more we can start explaining it from classical, not misrepresenting it, not bringing brand new liberal interpretation. No, purely classical interpretation from classical scholars. That's all I'm going to bring from classical understandings of Islam. Okay, so please, thank you.
We'll take one more question. Of course, you can have all of these come back during summation speeches, Abdullah. There's an opportunity.
It's only 4 minutes and there's so much. I've got a whole page for.
So one more question, please, from the floor, if we can. Just at the back of there, the lady at the back.
I'm Lisa Martinez from GC Rebuttal College. I've got a question for Abdullah. When you mentioned that Islam is compatible with freedom of speech and has always encouraged debate. You cited the example of St. John of Damascus in Syria. And I was wondering, when he published his refutation and it was disseminated in Syria, was the whole state, was the state religion of Syria Muslim, or were Christians and Muslims living?
It was under the Umayyad Caliphate, I believe. Yeah. It was under Islamic rule, yeah.
Right, okay. And I had just another question. The Christian Crusades started because pilgrims were not allowed access to their sacred sites by the Muslims who lived there. And they were being attacked and massacred. So I don't think that...
Is there a question there, someone?
Well, it is a question. I was wondering how does that instance reflect Islam's respect of freedom of worship?
Okay. Well, I invite everyone to research the history themselves, not just take my word for it, please. Just do your own research, and especially what they've said, also do your own research. So basically, no, there was no, for about 500-600 years, Christians had been going to pilgrimage with no problem to Jerusalem. Under the Seljuks was when the Catholic Church wanted to, there was a plea for help from the Byzantine Roman, or the remains of the Roman Empire, basically, who were losing against the Seljuks. And they just wanted a few Frankish knights as mercenaries to bolster their army. And what they got was a much larger response, more than what the Byzantines probably wanted. And of course, the propaganda was that, we're here, we're going to rescue the poor Christian pilgrims that are being massacred, and Christian babies are being roasted alive and eaten by Muslims, and the usual stuff, the propaganda that was typical fare in the medieval world. But what I wanted to raise, related to kind of historical distortions, the gentleman previously mentioned that, for example, historical monuments like the Buddhas of Bamiyan were destroyed by the Taliban, and other such iconoclastic issues. I wanted to simply ask him, so when were they destroyed? Because Afghanistan's been under Islam for about 1,400 years, so like, did Muslims only recently notice, oh, wait a second, there's a bunch of statues in Afghanistan, let's destroy that, we missed a few. Yeah? No, those who destroyed it, the Taliban, ask them why they destroyed it. But Muslims have been seeing those statues for 1,400 years. Also in Syria, I believe it was Palmyra. It's been under Muslim rule for 1,400 years. No destructions of anything. Right? But what, did Muslims just forget about it for 1,400 years on a long to-do list? So these are the historical issues that you need to study the history yourself to see what really happened. And I strongly urge and kind of not believe the kind of rhetoric of modern day, let's say, ideologues and others who are just trying to stir hatred against another Semitic minority, in Europe, basically. Although, ironically, you could say that Christianity was the first Semitic religion that came. Judaism came, I suppose, first, but they also faced persecution too. Is it like a rite of passage in Western Europe to persecute or to question Semitic religions that come there? But anyway, yeah.
Very, very quickly, if you want to respond, keep it to unrelated. Respond to what? To anything other than...
They just asked us, did they?
1 minute, what respond?
On the issue of sex segregation that Abdullah had mentioned, toilets are segregated, what's the big deal? And I do want to make this point that, there are a lot of points, but this specific one is that, segregated toilets is not the same as racial apartheid. The reason racial apartheid has been recognized as a crime against humanity is because the segregation is based on discrimination. And that is what applies when we speak about sex segregation in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. It is segregation because women are seen to be the source of fitna in society, which is why they have to be segregated, which is why men cannot shake hands with a woman. And it's also the argument for veiling women. And so it is very similar to racial apartheid, it's sex apartheid. And in fact, women's rights campaigners from Iran and Afghanistan are calling in the UN to recognize sex segregation like they have racial segregation and racial apartheid as a crime against humanity. So you can't just say, well, because toilets are segregated, why are you so upset about sex segregation in Islam? When it comes to discrimination, these are very serious issues. Unfortunately, it's not taken very seriously from those on that side because I understand you're believers. And of course you have a right to love your religion. And that's your prerogative in the same way that I, as an atheist, don't like religion. And I think we can respect each other as human beings. But at the same time, we should be able to recognize that a lot of human rights violations are taking place as a result of Islamic law. And many of us are refugees for that very reason. And that it needs to be criticized, it needs to be discussed. And it's important to have that possibility to do that without being threatened and without losing our lives for it, because that is the reality for many of us in many cities and countries across the globe.
Sorry, but this side can also, I would like to respond to that as well.
I apologise, we have to move on to speeches of summation now. We don't have enough time for that.
Yeah.
So we do now proceed to speeches of summation from both sides of the House. And I urge you to stick to the 4-minute time limit. The bell is there for a reason. I first look to the opposition to deliver their speech of summation. The opposition.
So, misconception or perception of different perception of Islam, we can have it, it's fine, it's a freedom of belief. But regardless, when we hear, we actually quote Quran, what it says. We all read many interpretations of that. We researched on that. We lived through that. And it's exactly what's happening in countries like Iran or Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. In the proposition, it was said that Islam prohibits torture. So what is burning in hell? What is it when in the Quran says that when two people commit adultery, they must be confined in a house until they die? Isn't that torture? So, and yes, we can have many rules, as this gentleman says. Many places has rules. We stop you saying that you can talk later. That's fine. But if we come and handcuff you and torture you because you raised your hand, That's when it becomes problematic. There is no problem. You can, I don't know, you can pray to anything you want. But when it comes to imposing that on millions of people and killing you because they believe that you don't have the same right, that's a crime. Crime against humanity is defined as when it's intentional and it has been done to the mass. And that's what's happening to women. That's why we talk about gender apartheid, and that's what the Islamic laws and Quran done. If you notice, I didn't even mention Sharia or Hadith because people say that's a different interpretation. I actually mentioned Quran. It's right in the heart of Quran. Veiling women, we didn't talk about it. It's important. What is wrong with women that they need to cover themselves? In Iran, they told us you're the source of corruption. You provoke sexual feeling in men, which is an insult to men as well. When they, yes, people have the right. We have people who are wearing scarf and veil here. It's no problem. But I have the right to criticize it, to say, as a woman, why should I cover myself? What is it about me that I have to cover myself? That makes me invisible. That means I'm controlled. It's a mobile prison. That's why we talk about it. It's not just a piece of cloth. And again, in Quran says that women should cover themselves. And again, at the end, I know I don't have so much time. It says what we mean by human rights. We all have different interpretation. Every religion has their own interpretation. Every government has. I'm not even going to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All I'm saying that, to me, in my belief, human rights includes the right to life, the right not to be tortured, and the right to have freedom of expression. No matter where you are from, these are your fundamental rights. And if you don't believe in that, then no debate can change your mind. If you believe in that, then you need to stand up to any religion, any rules who says otherwise. And it's important when you step out of here not to be scared to criticize Islam, so they call you Islamophobia or anything like that. I don't have a phobia from Islam. Phobia is an irrational fear of something. I have a rational objection. I have protest against the laws that discriminate against human beings, that divide us based on our gender, based on our belief, and tell me what to do and what to say as a woman. So therefore, no matter what we believe, what religion you have, what you want to wear, if you believe in right to life, right to not to be tortured, right to have a freedom of expression, then you have to stand up for that. Thank you.
I look to the proposition to deliver their speech of summation. Thank you.
Now, I argued that you don't have, this debate is not about whether you agree with Islam. Clearly, if you're not a Muslim, then obviously you wouldn't agree with Islam, otherwise you would be a Muslim. This debate is about, does Islam give a set of inviolable rights for human beings, maybe according to its own conception, maybe according to morals and values, a different value system than maybe a materialist one. But is there inviolable laws and values which we can say that this is a human rights? Because we talk about Hammurabi's law code, we talk about Cyrus the Great's law code, even though we don't agree with it, but we say this was the first establishment of human rights. Do we not? So then, if Islam has a set of laws which the leader can't break, which the mob mentality of society can't break, then that is sufficient to make the point that Islam has a conception of human rights. It need not be your particular conception, but it merely has a conception. And all we have to show is that some interpretation of Islam agrees with some conception of human rights for our side to make the case in this debate. Now, as I mentioned, the Prophet Muhammad said, anyone who tortures people in this life will be tortured by God in the next. I quote narrations of the Prophet Muhammad. I quote where the Quran says that God says to men and women, one of you is as the other. It's a quotation, you can check it for yourself. The men and women are equally valued. But Islam merely recognizes that men and women aren't identical. And you can't expect women to go off to war and men to stay at home. right? And the Ukraine has realized this. When female Ukrainians are not going to war, but male Ukrainians are going to war, right? So here's the issue. There are many issues that were brought up. And here's one issue. If America or UK or France, the first Enlightenment countries, you could say, break your conception of human rights, no one says human rights are at fault or one particular ideology is at fault. They say these are countries, are bad countries. But Saudi, Iran, and Afghanistan or whoever does something bad, oh, that's Islam. Oh, that is Islam, right? Even though you'll find tons of Muslim scholars in the Muslim world imprisoned because they criticize the regime from a Quranic basis and from the basis of the hadith of Prophet Muhammad. As for other issues, and I wish we could discuss this, I actually was once, there was an event organized at the London School of Economics and Political Science. They invited Maryam Namazie and invited me to do a one-on-one debate where she can bring all those issues out. We have a one-on-one debate so we can have a big discussion about it. She pulled out. Yeah, just like they don't take people's points of information. I'm all for that. I want public debate. I want there to be a detailed deliberation on every single one of their points because they've misrepresented it. And it's not me just twisting the text or what have you, but it's the case in point. A man went out to the Prophet Muhammad and said that he wanted to renege his pledge of Islam. The Prophet didn't kill him. And the guy just walked, this Bedouin guy, he just walked away. If it was killing anyone who just changed their mind about Islam, what have you, then you would have got that. But instead, it was because this guy wasn't committing sedition and treason, that guy wasn't punished. But they say, well, you have a punishment for adultery. Well, we could argue that doesn't the person who's being cheated on have a right to dignity? Right? That needs to be protected? That people can be cheated on? Do you think that makes people happy? As for, there's many other issues that they've raised, and I wish I could cover every single one of them. But, I mean, and again, just to illustrate this point, they bring a verse of Quran that said that, women are, referencing to men, women are till for you, approach them as you see fit. And they say, oh, look, this is showing women are objects. No, this was basically a verse of Quran dealing with a question on sex positions. Because there was one people, one town, the women said we don't like, no, they said it's not customary for us to be approached from a certain angle, and is it okay or is it not? And everyone asked the Prophet Muhammad, and then the verse of Quran came down, and this is how they misrepresent it. But please check it out for yourself. Don't just take my word for it, and especially don't take their word for it. So what I will say is this, is that don't research sex positions, research the Quranic quote, please. Don't don't get confused on that issue, yeah? Oops, I was just doing research for academic purposes, of course.
You can do what?
All right. All right. So what I merely say is this. You might not agree with Islam's understanding of values or morality. It might be something that is different from your background or culture. But if you agree that if you've seen that Islam has rights for human beings which are inviolable, then you have to side with proposition today. At the very least, as Hammurabi, as Cyrus the Great, we all agree they believe in human rights, and likewise, Islam believes in human rights. It might not be your particular interpretation, but indeed is human rights. Thank you.
Thank you to both sides for their contributions this evening. And we shall now move to voting on the motion before the House. At the Union, we first vote by acclamation, meaning if you agree with the motion, please say aye, and if you disagree with the motion, you say no. So, all of those in favour of the motion that Islam is compatible with human rights, please say aye. Aye. All those against, please say no. No! The House
it's too loud to say no.
Oh, we're not allowed. They're allowed to.
I'm sorry.
The House is divided, so we therefore move to vote by division. If you agree with the motion, please make your way through the ayes door, just over here. And if you disagree with the motion, please make your way over to the nose door. 1 second. The nose door over there. I appoint as tellers for the nose door, William Rome, and tellers for the ayes door, Theo Stubbs. If you ask a question, please don't forget to collect your invitation from the Secretary's desk at the front. And the winner of the floor speech prize is Ethan of South College for his contribution.
Yes!
Otherwise, thank you all. Thank you all for attending, and I think this meeting is closed. Thank you.
both very much. It's very impressive.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers.
For the ayes, 50. For the noes, 37. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The motion is hereby carried, and thank you all for attending. Thank you.